Well, we're delighted to welcome back Professor Micheál Siochrú. He is an expert, as we said before, on modern Irish history. And Micheál, today we're going to talk about, I suppose, the commemoration of historical events, how we as historians, and I suppose how the general public have viewed a lot of these events. But could I begin by asking you, is the commemoration of historical events a good thing?
We have a very strange relationship with commemoration here in Ireland. We remember various different events. We've got marches, we've got various sort of conferences and events around them. But as a state, we seem very uncomfortable with celebrating or commemorating our past. Unlike, for example, the Americans with the 4th of July or the French with Bastille Day, we've never been quite sure how to commemorate our independence. And I think part of that comes from, if you like, the incomplete nature of that independence because of the civil war that followed and partition. A lot of people would say that hasn't been finished and therefore there's nothing to commemorate or to celebrate. There's also the troubled relationship we have with the manner in which independence came about through violent means, as so many revolutions are, obviously. But that has left, if you like, an uncomfortable legacy for the people who inherited power in this state and has left them unsure as how best to go about the process of commemoration.
And sometimes the commemoration of these events has been blamed for causing further violence. For example, the commemoration of the 1916 Rising in 1966 was blamed a few years later then for contributing to the Troubles.
Absolutely. I mean, they said there was a very militaristic sort of tone to the 50th anniversary celebrations of the 1916 Rising in 1966, and that, if you like, encouraged perhaps young idealists to take up the struggle again. I myself don't buy that at all. I mean, I think it's quite unusual in a society where we have every year triumphalist commemoration around the Orange Marches, remembering the Battle of the Boyne and the victory of the Protestants and the creation of the Protestant ascendancy, that one event, the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, should have such a major impact that we end up causing, if you like, the Troubles or the conflict that breaks out in Ireland a few years later. So I think that is overstated, I have to say, in my view. At the same time, there's no doubt that how we view the past does have an impact on the present. So I think it's important that we do it correctly. And I do think that historians have a role in that. I'm uncomfortable, I have to say, at the moment with the manner in which we're going about the current, what they're calling decade of commemoration, this crucial period in Irish history from 1912 to 1922. And the reason I'm uncomfortable is that it's very much state-controlled, state-directed. And there's no harm in the state having an interest in this. Of course it has an interest in this. But as a historian, I think we need to approach this differently. And I don't think that we're not politicians, we're historians. And we need to retain our credibility and our academic discipline in how we go about commemorating, remembering these particular events from the past.
And even as you say there, the decade ends in 1922. But of course, the Civil War then goes on till 23. So does it mean that you commemorate all these things but leave out the Civil War?
I've never been quite sure. I mean, I suppose a decade is a nice kind of catchy title. You can say the 11 years of commemoration. So perhaps they're just sort of using that title. But it does seem to me that, yes, there's a very definite decision here not to sort of, if you like, deal with the problems of the Civil War and the emotions that might raise. And perhaps, you know, the sort of confrontational aspect of that might still resonate today. So they're kind of going to avoid that particular sort of period because it doesn't suit the message. And the message very clearly, to me, that's coming across from this whole process of commemoration is about balance. It's about all of us together looking at our past in a united, unified way. And it's not the nationalist history, it's not the unionist history, it's a shared history. Now, I don't understand, and maybe you can explain to me, Patrick, how can you share the history of the coloniser and the colonised? How do you share the history of the oppressor and the oppressed? They've got a different experience, different viewpoints, and we might look at them at the same time, but they're not shared experiences. And I think we're moving down a very dangerous road here if we feel that everything has to be balanced, that there has to be, if we're talking about bad on one side, but you have to look at bad on the other side because we can't be, biased in any kind of way at all. Now, that might be good politics. It might be good for community relations, but is it history? I have to say I still have my doubts.
Let's look at some of those events then. One of them, of course, is the horror of the First World War. And the Irish fought in large numbers and died in large numbers in the First World War. We've always had a difficulty in this country, really up until recent years, acknowledging that. And how do you think we should approach the commemoration of that then?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, even within my own family, there was a granduncle who fought and died in the British Army that I knew nothing about. It was only a few years ago that he was mentioned suddenly out of the blue, and we, in our family, had never been talked about. So these things can be airbrushed out. As you say, it is part of our history, and we have to look into this, and it's a very important part of our history. We had over 250,000, I think it is, Irish men who volunteered and were then conscripted into the British Army, fought, died, etc., and that can't be ignored. Again, my issue with this is I have no problem commemorating the individuals who went and to explore why they went, etc. I've got a problem sometimes with the way the First World War is commemorated, and particularly around the issue of the poppy, which always seems to be the controversial issue. Should people wear the poppy as they do in Britain as part of the commemoration of the First World War? My problem, as I said, is not commemorating those individuals. The poppy, to me, however, is part of an official government commemoration. This is the same government, the same monarchy that sent those men to die in their hundreds of thousands in needless conflicts on the fields of Flanders. And I don't want to be part of any official commemoration of that. And I think we need to find perhaps more appropriate ways of doing this than we currently have.
Yeah, I think there's also an issue that some of the money for the poppy goes to some of these army regiments that who also would have served in Ireland during that revolutionary period and also in later years. And yeah, I think for people in Ireland then, because some people do say, oh, in Ireland we should wear the poppy and this should be a unifying gesture between North and South and between Ireland and Britain. But you can see how then it can also be uncomfortable because it could be seen as a militaristic symbol.
I think you're right, and I think we need to move beyond it now. I think the poppy has proved itself to be controversial, whether rightly or wrongly, or whether you think that too much is being made of this. But I think we need to find different ways now of doing this. It is part of our history, and it is something that we need to explore, examine, understand, and engage with, but in a positive way, rather than in perhaps some of the more militaristic or official ways that have been laid out for us over the last 90 years or so.
When we move forward then to the War of Independence, or the Anglo-Irish War, whatever people call it now, but again there, in recent years, there seems to be a lot of discussion about the violence of that period, the fact that atrocities were committed by the revolutionaries, the fact that many of them suffered post-traumatic guilt afterwards, and it has kind of in a way made people reassess that period.
Yeah, I'm always kind of slightly bemused by this kind of, as you say, almost obsession with the violence of the revolutionary period. It was a war, Patrick. People fought, they died, they were killed, they killed. That's the nature of a conflict. It is ugly. All war is ugly. Whatever conflict you want to look at, you see this is going on. So why, in the Irish context, we seem absolutely obsessed with particular incidents and events, and were 3 people killed here or 5, or who did this, where and what? Of course, this is part of the history and we need to look at it, but it has become almost a raison d'etre for these studies of this period. And I think in doing so, we're kind of losing context here about why this is taking place, some of the bigger issues involved here, and become just, as I say, completely bogged down the minutiae. And there's some very nasty arguments going on at the moment about historians lying and people making up evidence, and it becomes, I think, very counterproductive. So I think it's time for everybody, if you like, just to let off a bit of steam now and just take a step back and perhaps approach this in a more constructive way than we've done of late.
When people look at this period, they tend to see it in terms of opposing figures, Collins v Dev. Even for the 1916 Rising, people tend to be either a Pearse person or maybe a Connolly person. Is that again maybe a simplistic way, because it's very easy to take sides, especially say during the treaty debates, and maybe history has been on the side of Collins and the pro-treaty side. Is that maybe a natural thing for people to take sides?
I think it is. I mean, Ireland is quite a small country in terms of population-wise. The connections are all there. Almost every family would be in some way. Their ancestors, their parents, grandparents would have been involved to some degree in the conflict at the time, what was going on, and that shaped their own views and those of their children and grandchildren thereafter. So I think that personal element is almost inevitable in such a small country. We can't get away from it, whether you're a De Valera man or a Collins man and all that kind of way. At the same time, I think also it's easier for people sometimes to identify with a person rather than with an abstract idea or with an ideology. And so again, just in terms of history and how we engage with it, that sort of identification with an individual, I think, is quite a natural thing to do in some ways. I think in Ireland, that sort of cult of the individual has also been problematic in the way that it has impacted on Irish politics and indeed Irish life generally since the struggle for independence. And also, for example, those who died, be it in 1916, the leaders who were executed, or the great iconic figure Micheál Collins, ambushed in 1922. They remain, if you like, sort of, these perfect figures because they never had to deal with the messy compromise that comes after any conflict. They never have to get involved in the dirty business of day-to-day politics. They remain unsullied, this beautiful sort of pristine state, and we can look up to them and we can make all these bold claims that, Padraig Pearse would never have done this, or Micheál Collins would never have tolerated X, Y, or Z, in the sure knowledge it can never be challenged because we will never know. So it's interesting how we do this, but I don't think Ireland's probably unique in that, probably only because, if you like, the small nature or the small numbers involved, the closeness is there perhaps more than elsewhere, but it happens in most histories, I think.
Is there a figure from this period who you particularly admire?
Well, having just said that we shouldn't be admiring these iconic, pristine figures who died, I think probably for me, there's a number of different people from that period who I personally would have some affiliation with, you like. Liam Mellows is somebody who I find particularly interesting. He was a socialist, a very progressive thinker, somebody involved from very early stages of the struggle who is executed during the Civil War. So again, he doesn't survive into the post-war period, but I think he was so far ahead of his time, and some of the ideas he was propounding, in a way, that kind of, intelligent foresight and understanding was perhaps to some degree missing when independence came about. So he'd be somebody, I think, that perhaps was a great loss to the Irish nation.
So what kind of Ireland do you think emerged then from all of this all of this struggle? Because very often people say, as you say, what would Pearse have thought, or what would Collins have done? And people say, we haven't lived up to the ideals of the 1916 Rising or the Proclamation. What kind of Ireland did come out of all of this?
I think it was probably a very different Ireland, perhaps those who fought and died expected. And that's in the nature of the messy sort of outcome in terms of the incomplete nature of it with partition, the fact that it wasn't initially a republic, it was a free state, still linked to the British Empire. So it was in some senses, unsatisfactory from that point of view. And as the people who emerged as the leaders of the new state themselves admitted, they were very conservative revolutionaries. They adopted much of the English political system. They didn't really want that much change. They just wanted themselves in charge, so to speak. So in some ways it was quite different perhaps to what was expected from the initial revolutionary impulse. At the same time, and we can criticise that and say, look how they failed to live up and be, sort of ticking boxes about, how they let us down. At the same time, they had some incredible achievements, and the biggest one to me was the preservation of democracy when it would have been incredibly difficult given the divisions, the bitterness of the Civil War, but also the prevailing political impulses across Europe at this time towards fascism and communism, that throughout all that, and despite all the pressures both internally and externally, that those initial founder fathers of the Irish Free State managed to preserve a democratic state, an institution where the people can vote for their own representatives. And that, to me, is a remarkable achievement and one that should be lauded. So we can criticise, but I do think they deserve a lot of credit as well.
Professor Micheál Siochrú, thank you for joining us. Thank you for bringing the past to life. Thank you for being a part of this course.
Thanks very much.